Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
On today's Your Take, I'm joined by a guest who gives us an insight into a filmmaking process. We take you into the mind of a post-production creative who has one of the most important roles in a film crew. That is assembling and putting together images and sound to create the finished cut. You obviously guessed that I'm joined by a film editor today. My guest has been working in the film industry since the mid-1980s. She's mainly specialised in children's television output and has an impressive CV. Her credits include assistant editor on the Wind In the Willows series and the 1989 animated feature-length adaptation of the BFG. She worked on the TV movie On Christmas Eve, Bob the Builder, and was editor on Danger Mouse, Noddy's Toyland Adventures, Rex the Runt, Pingu, and Shaun the Sheep. Today I'm joined by Jane Hicks. We discuss Jane's early life, what inspired her to become a film editor, the process and skills required, some of the projects she has worked on, and a take on the changes to the editing process during her time in the industry. Good evening, Jane.
Hi, James. Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good, yeah, very warm welcome. Thank you for, first and foremost, giving of your time and being a guest today on Your Take.
Well, I'm very flattered, completely honoured, thank you.
I've spoken to a few people who've worked in the film industry, a cinematographer and a couple of actors, but you're the first film editor. So I'm interested to find out what makes a film editor tick, the skills and requirements needed, and more importantly, to kind of trace your career and some of the highlights already mentioned. But first, Jane, can we go back to the very beginnings? Can I firstly ask you where and when you were born, and just a bit of an insight into your parents, who they were, what they did for a living, and do you have siblings?
Well, I was born in Wimbledon in London in 1960, a long time ago. My dad was an insurance broker he was actually an MD of a marine insurance company. It took me a long time to actually work out what he did for a living. But it wasn't a creative career, but he was a beautiful man, lovely man. And my mum was in the Wrens. They met during at the end of the Second World War. She was in the Wrens, and she ended up being a PA for an admiral. And she actually worked in the Admiralty building just off the Mall. So she had a lovely time. She said really enjoyed her career. But of course, in those days, had to give it all up as soon as she had my brother and I. My brother had a sort of similar career path to my dad. He's a little bit older than me, and he's also working in marine insurance, and he has his own company, and he insures hulls of ships. So whacking great big things like sort of oil tankers and stuff like that. So very interesting stuff on the legal side. Quite frightening, really. Some of the tales he tells. And what else can I tell you? I think I've just got the one brother. I think that's all. Questions answered.
An interesting insight into your upbringing, and interestingly, no signs of creativity so far.
Except my mum. Aha.
Yeah.
So my mum was actually quite a good painter. I think I got all of my creative, well, if there are any sort of creative bones in my body, from her. though she was a gifted woman. I was very jealous of a lot of her paintings, actually, and she taught me how to paint with oils and stuff. So I'm very, very thankful to her.
I wanted to come on to schooling because it does form kind of an important basis of our makeup and decisions we want to make in terms of maybe our career choices and perspectives, or what we want to do in life. And I wanted to ask you where you were schooled, and do you have fond memories from your time there? Which subjects did you excel in, and did you go on to further education?
Yeah, I loved school, actually, mostly for the social life, I think. And I think art was my love in life. So I'd spend hours and hours sketching in my bedroom and stuff. I started to study geology at A level, and I found I was pretty good at sketching the fossils and stuff like that. Doing the field sketches and things, the coastal geomorphology. That all kind of fed into going to art college, and did a degree at Hull, yeah, from then on, sort of, I was very lucky to fall into work fairly soon afterwards, but I'll tell you about that later, because it was actually very difficult to get my first job.
You mentioned your mum's love of painting, and that seems to me that was a huge influence on you. And then you've mentioned briefly about your educational years and going on to art college. But I wanted to talk about where this love of film or creativity in filmmaking, where that actually comes from, and when did you start becoming interested in film, and were there any filmmakers or films that particularly inspired you, and why did you specifically wanted to pursue a career as a film editor?
Okay, there's a few questions there. So let's think from early days at art college. First of all, I did a foundation course, and that was the first time that I really had anything much to do with film. Before then, I was very lucky to have done some photography with my uncle. He was a real enthusiast, and he set up some 3D cameras, just still cameras. So he was quite technically, he was very, very capable. So I had that sort of a little bit of a sort of technical insight into film, and I loved through the foundation course. They give you a few weeks, what they call primers in different subjects. So the photography primer was fantastic, loved that. But then they moved us on to film. And I'd never had the opportunity to work with film before, and I absolutely adored it. So what I actually found was we weren't allowed to use cameras, but we were allowed to use found footage. And I went through this massive box full of old odds and ends and things, and I found this a Super 8 reel of film, and I cut it up the middle, because it was double sprocketed at the time, so it's 16mm gauge. Cut it up the middle and stuck these little bits of Super 8 onto 16mm gauge film. And of course, as you project that, you get two images at once, dancing around with the screen. But you can actually make out, because it's obviously following a moving image, you can still make out what the kind of story of what's going on, kind of thing. So it was very much sort of experimental stuff. And then I started playing around with soundtracks, which at the time was a totally new thing to me, and just broke into a completely new sort of area of manipulating sound and image, and a time-based medium I never had the opportunity to work with before, and I think that's what really really kicked me off and really inspired me.
Can we discuss the discipline of being a film editor? But more so, can we discuss your early experimentation in film editing? How did you manage to learn how to edit? And can you talk about the film editing equipment you were using at that particular time?
When I started in a proper professional cutting room, we were working mostly on 16mm. And this was because it was a big animation studio that I was working in called Cosgrove Hall. And we had some like 8 cutting rooms, and each of the cutting rooms would have a flatbed editor, like I think it was Steenbeck's, Chems and Steenbeck's mostly we used, and we'd complement those with PicSync, for which was kind of the general workhorse at the time. So with a picture synchronizer, you'd have one small picture head about so big, with a manual wind on it, with quite a nasty little image. You could just about work out what was going on. But the synchronization happened because you had 4 soundtracks alongside the picture head. So you could be editing a sound. You have sound heads, which are sound head on each track, and then you could edit your sound quite easily because it's very accessible. You grab your sound, grab your mag track, bring it over, slice it, mark it, slice it, and join it back. And you could actually track play something like 4 tracks at a time. So it was quite a fundamental sort of way of working, I suppose. But it did the job. For a smoother job, you'd take yourself over to one of the flatbed Steenbecks, and you'd have a much more luxurious day track playing that way. For the assistants in animation, most of the work that you did would be logging rushes, and maybe a little bit of assembly, but the assembly was very, very simple because everything was idented, everything was slated, everything was shot mute, of course. So then the skill came with syncing up. But if you'd like, I can tell you a little bit about the animation process, because for an editor, it was a very different kind of a job. Mm-hmm. I suppose the very beginning of the process and the very end of the process are similar to live action, in that you'll start with the script, and then and the script will be recorded by your voice talents. Then the mag will come back to the cutting room. The editors will cut down the show to the script, alongside the director. And then, because with animation, it's such a costly process, the idea is that you will cut your soundtrack to pretty much the exact running length of the final program. You'll give yourself a tiny bit of slack. Say with a 10-minute program, you probably give yourself 8 to 10 seconds slack, because if you're overshooting, it can be very, very costly. So basically, you'll end up with a soundtrack which will probably be very accurate to the finished thing. And then the assistant editors, poor beasts, do this awful thing called phonetic breakdown. So assume it's a lip sync show. So all the dialogue has to be read and notated in phonetic form, so that the animator will know the particular mouth shape to be using on every single frame of the film. So that's quite a painstaking job. And that was the first thing that I was taught to do. And I had to do that for months and months and months until I was allowed to do anything else. Then, of course, you have the animation will either be shot under rostrum camera, or else it will be shot in the studio, stop frame studio with puppets or models, and then the editors will assemble rushes, and once you've got everything in the can, the fine cut will happen, and then the sound post-production will start, or the track laying will begin, and then mixing, dubbing, and then Ebony's various different versions and revoices and things, and so it goes on and on and on, you know.
I wanted to backtrack slightly and pick up on something you mentioned previously in our conversation, and that was going back to art college, you having a love for creativity and wanting to pursue this career in film editing, but you mentioned how difficult it was to get that break into the actual industry. I wanted to ask you how that happened, and can you recall your first paid credit and what that experience was like?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it was so difficult because at the time the film union was called the ACTT, the Association of Cinematographic and Television Technicians, and it was a closed shop, which meant that you couldn't get a job unless you had a union card, and you couldn't get a union card unless you had a job. So
Pretty much impossible then.
It was totally impossible. Yeah. But I was so lucky that I had a friend who was a union member, who and the union used to publish a job sheet every week, and she passed me this job sheet, and I applied for the trainee assistant editor's job up in Manchester with Cosgrove Hall, and I bluffed my way through the interview. Don't tell them that. And got the job. So amazed. So I suppose I started working on the Wind in the Willows TV feature film, and then the spin-off series from that. So I'm sure my first credit, I think, must have been on Wind in the Willows, I reckon. And of course, proud as anything. Had to make my mum and dad tune in to watch the Wind in the Willows just to see my name. You know. And then years later, my mum told me, well, we didn't used to watch the programme, we only used to watch the credits. I'm sure they're not the only proud parents to have done that.
A lovely programme to work on, and
oh, it was, yeah.
Timely moment as well, because that was going to be my next chapter in our interview, to discuss your work on that particular program. And very fond memories from me growing up in the 80s as a child. I used to watch this.
Oh, did you?
On television. So yeah, very young at the time, but fond memories. But how did the opportunity come about? And can you talk about the challenges in editing a stop motion television, children's television series at that time in the 1980s?
Yeah, I was really, really lucky to get this job with Cosgrove Hall, and I stayed with the company for a long, long time. I absolutely loved working there. The challenges of working, I suppose we'd be working on several different shows. Quite often in the same day, because there were very many tasks that needed to be done. And as a trainee assistant, you may only be involved in one very specific area of the production, and which could mean that your work was actually quite repetitive. But you were still learning, so hey ho. So, for example, I could be doing the phonetic breakdown on a 10-minute program, which would take approximately 2 weeks. So it was, it was a very intense process, and very tiring as well, because it's well, the interpretation is just it's a bit of a killer, to tell you the truth, especially when you've got conflicting sound and not working with headphones. But it was a fantastic studio to work for, and there was a real variety of work going on, because it was quite a unique place. There were studios where they would shoot the stop frame model animation, and there were upstairs there were studios where they would animate the 2D Danger Mouse, I think at the time, and several other series a bit later on, so there was a huge sort of range of styles and specialities and talents in the same building. You know, it was a wonderful place.
If we fast forward the clock on 40 years, a lot of these programs you've worked on have become childhood television classics, and they're beloved by a certain generation. I say my generation. But at the time when you saw these programs first broadcast, what was your kind of initial reaction to them?
After those that I'd been working on, I was, incredibly proud, because they were very high standard. I think what I'd grown up with, sorry, because I'm somewhat older than you, James, but what I'd grown up with was probably more string puppet, the Wooden Tops, not Andy Pandy, Thunderbirds even, So there was a certain magic with stop frame animation, and I think that was something that really really stuck with me, and really was very heartfelt. I think that there was a reality, a totally new reality, a new world that could be created with stop frame that was probably, you have a very different reaction, I think, to, because I don't know about you, but I feel totally drawn in by stop frame, whereas cell animation 2D is more of a comic strip, I suppose. It's because it's a flat image, it kind of has a flat style to me. The world, there isn't this kind of different reality that can be sort of taken as a real reality. Sorry, I can't think of the words. I think what I'm trying to get at is the soundscape that you can create with a 3D world that is less full, I suppose, with a flat 2D world. As starting as an assistant, in animation, the one of the main jobs of the editors was to lay the soundtracks, which was basically creating the soundscapes, the worlds that the characters would sit in. So that was, I think that was the main skill that I learned first off.
Interestingly, if we look at your career throughout the 1980s, the 1990s, and even into the new millennium, into the 2000s, you worked on several popular children's television programs. But what made you decide to specifically focus on making children's programming? It's
so much fun. So much. I enjoyed it so much. There was there was so much comedy. So it was sweet. It was sweet. It was fun. I was working for the same company for an awful long time, and because of the nature of an animation editor's type of work, it really is a specialism that's different to a live action gig, because there are so many processes involved. The editing part of the job kind of happens at the soundtrack and storyboard stage, and then later at the final cut. And in between, there are an awful lot of other tasks to perform, which are very specific to animation. So once after my first sort of 10 years working with Cosgrove Hall, I found myself very much sort of in a niche, I suppose. So I stayed with it, and I loved that world. I loved creating, helping to create and to collaborate with some very, very talented directors. I was very lucky to work with.
Do you think being in that niche, as you call it, and in that world, do you think you can be almost more creative? Because in some ways you're catering for two audiences, one audience being children of a certain target audience, but also for grown-ups as well. So you can maybe be more imaginative, more playful, and maybe put in innuendos and jokes that are subtle in a way, but they play to that kind of adult audience as well as the child audience at the same time. Yeah,
totally. I totally agree with you. Yes, yeah, very much so. There was and there were. I also worked on some animation which wasn't aimed at a preschool audience or even a child audience. So something called Crapston Villas, and another series called Pond Life. I'm so sorry, by Candy Guard. Yeah, neither of which were children's series, I suppose. There's a Pond Life was really very challenging, actually. In terms of a soundtrack, it was really interesting to work on, because it was 2D show, and the backgrounds were very, very sparse. So the world appeared very sparse. So what we did with the sound was to make everything very, very clean and very magnified. So, for example, Dolly Pond was the main character. Her footsteps, she wore high-heeled shoes. So her footsteps were something like that. So very clacky sort of kind of a sound.
Yeah.
We didn't bother giving anybody else footsteps. So you could be very, well, I suppose in a way manipulative, but that's not a very nice word, I think. You can direct attention. What else can I tell you? I've adored working on all the children's programs. It was just delightful, and learnt so much from each of them. Not just in terms of how to put the thing together. They were just beautiful stories.
If we pick up on some of those projects you worked on, and many were mentioned in the introduction, the BFG animated feature film, Bob the Builder, Chuggington, Danger Mouse, Pingu, Shaun the Sheep, many, many more, some of which you've mentioned already. But do you have a particular project you've most enjoyed working on, and why?
Pingu, I loved, because he was just so naughty. and I was very lucky to be working in this particular cutting room here at home when I'd received the rushes, and I would just laugh out loud, and my partner would come in just to wonder what on earth was going on. Truckers, I want to talk about truckers. Terry Pratchett's Truckers.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
I think it was one of the last series I worked on with Cosgrove Hall, and that was fantastic because I was given the job of the sound design on that show, just briefly speaking, the central characters are gnomes, who the puppets themselves were about so big, beautiful puppets, and compared to, I think they lived at 8 times human speed. So that was the kind of brief for the sound design. But of course, 8 times human speed was just so. So we played it somewhere in between, you know. So the humans were Groot, things, and it was played from the nose perspective all the time, really. So we did things when we were creating atmospheres inside. There was a chapel environment, and I had a belfry, which is like a chime bar. There's probably about sort of 20 chimes on it or so. I said to the sound engineer, I think this will work really, really nicely. And I was playing it with my fingers, and it was just way too solid, way too solid. And he passed me a feather, and he said, "Jane, try this." I did, and it was just amazing, because you have there's no contact. There's only the sound of the chime bar itself. It was gorgeous. So we slowed that down. I think we recorded it onto 1/4 inch, I think it was, and played it back at 7.5. Must have been half speed. I think we recorded at 15, played it back at 7.5. And then put some effects on it, and then I think, I said, why don't we just play that in reverse? And that's what we ended up with. It's just lovely to do stuff like that.
Interesting that you mentioned Pingu as a favourite. Again, I remember it first time round as a young child, and my 2 children recently discovered it via Amazon Prime, and they were constantly playing them. And I think the theme tune, the end credits, is great. I've got the tune in my head as we speak.
Yeah.
We move from some of those favourite moments in your career, some of your highlights, to another chapter in your life. How were you introduced to Bristol's Aardman Animations? And can you discuss your involvement on Chicken Run, and then later on the Shaun the Sheep television series?
Okay, I was freelance at the time. Actually, I'd started my own, together with an ex-colleague from Cosgrove Hall. We'd started a small post-production company in Soho, so I actually approached Aardman. I knew that they had a series called Rex the Runt coming up. And I actually approached Aardman. I said, well, have you got an editor yet? Because I'd love to work with you. So lucky that they said, yeah, go on then. So I ended up working with Richard Golochowski. And that was a fantastic experience. They Rex the Runt. I don't know if you would have heard of it. Or
again, I can remember it. Yeah.
Can you?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't on air very long at all. But I think it's one of my favourite shows I ever worked on. Again, laughed out loud. Brilliant little show, and very complex as well. Actually, really complex. So many composited shots. It was and I'm sure one of the animators will, or even Golly himself will correct me on this. But a lot of the animation was shot because they were like gingerbread dogs, like gingerbread men, almost flat, only very slightly 3D. And they were shot, some of the animation was shot on glass. And then it was composited against quite often a live action background. So anyway, these dogs could be anywhere, do anything. So I worked on the first series of 2 series of Rex, I think it was the second series. And then I think I was invited back. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm sure I must have approached them again, actually, to work on Chicken Run. And all I was doing on Chicken Run actually was the phonetic breakdown. And then Shaun the sheep. So that came along again with Golly. So that was another very interesting, different kind of show to work on again. And quite a fast turnaround. Tricky, a lot of picture post-production on that one, because the sheep would be doing all kinds of acrobatics. So of course the models had to be rigged, and then these rigs painted out. So that was quite a complex procedure. And then quite a funny story on that one. When we'd finished and delivered the first series to the BBC, Disney, pretty sure it was Disney, wanted to take the series. But sheep being sheep, there were piles of poo all over the place in the fields. So my assistant Andy and I had the job of de-pooing Shaun the sheep for Disney, and which was a bit of a task because quite often the animators would be having fun in the background action. So main character is going on here, background action, somebody lifts a tail and whoop. So all that had to be taken out. So there was a lot of de-pooing to do.
We move from Aardman and look back at your 40-year career as an editor in the film and TV industry, and you've obviously seen immense technological change and advancement. Which changes would you say you've embraced, and how do you see the future for cinema and television, particularly with the advent of streaming services, being able to see things on demand, more accessibility, more choice of channels? What's kind of your view of it all?
It's immense, isn't it? It's immense. I think I'm hoping there's always going to be a place for a TV in your sitting room, a safe place where you can sit with your kids, share a laugh, and know what's going on for each other. To share a screen, I mean, it's quite a rare thing these days, isn't it? With to share a device, for example, but sitting in a room, sharing a program with somebody is something I think to be really cherished. So I hope that TVs will stay in our living rooms and be shared, and devices won't be well, the children won't be encouraged to hide away behind devices, I suppose, on their own. Streaming, I think it's fantastic. Immediacy, brilliant. I suppose my one criticism would be that there's just too much.
I agree. Yeah, you
you
could almost spend longer time watching a film actually trying to find a film or a television program to watch. Yeah, there's almost, like you say, there's almost too much content.
Yeah. And in terms of sort of technicalities, yeah, I embrace them. I think as much as a 60-year-old woman can do. Yes.
Interestingly, you started in your early years working on, 8mm film or 16mm, the old, what I guess is called the old analog process of editing. And then you saw this digital revolution happen, I guess, around the late 90s. Did you find it easy to adapt to that change? Did it come naturally, or did you
Right.
did you kind of almost fear your position as an editor in some ways, that all this kind of technological change was happening so fast and so quickly?
No, not at all. It was fantastic. The only thing that I think was a problem for me, because film editing is pretty non-linear anyway. But the only thing that was an issue for me was the cost of the equipment. It was phenomenal. So I remember I had to buy 3 gigs worth of storage for my Avid, and I think it cost £3,000. Honestly. So the equipment was blindingly expensive, but actually getting to grips with it was relatively easy. I was very lucky, because I was working for a small company who indirectly for Cosgrove Hall, because everybody was made redundant when Thames TV lost the franchise. The Cosgrove Hall was owned by Thames TV at the time. Thames lost the franchise. Everything was kind of up in the air. Small companies set up to service production that was still going on in the studio. And I was working for one of these smaller companies who took out a massive loan on their houses and bought the first Avid and Audiovision, I think it was, that was on the market at the time. And these machines were just kept working night and day, basically. So I popped in there and did the night shift on the Audiovision. So it was fine for me, because I just very lucky that I just took to it. So lots of mistakes and took ages to begin with, but hey ho. So I was very lucky to have something to be playing with and to be able to work with.
We've established that your niche has been very much in animation and children's television programming, and you've mentioned your fondness and the luck and opportunity of working on so many of those great shows that are still heralded 40 years on as being favorites by so many people. We all have such great childhood memories. But that aside, would you have liked to work on more film and television projects, maybe outside of the children's television sphere? And second to that, are you working on any current projects, or do you have any in the pipeline?
I've worked on a couple of shows, or short films actually, which have gone to festivals, and with some success. Desperately competitive festivals, aren't they? Crikey. I'm used to having the BBC to rely on, honestly.
I sometimes feel awful saying about awards, because I sometimes feel most of the time that the wrong films win the awards. Especially Oscars. Yeah, but that's just subjective.
Yeah. So I've worked on a couple of short films, and really enjoyed working. Well, it's all a collaborative process, So it's just so much fun working with people. And now I haven't got anything in the pipeline at the moment, but what I do get on with is I just cut little sort of short things together just for fun, for people's birthdays and stuff like that. just send them a bit of rubbish or old cine material that we've shot together or something. So I'm really just having fun with it now, James.
We've spoken in so much detail on the editing process, and you've gone at great length to discuss what's involved, the projects you've worked on. One thing we haven't spoken about is any editors that you would cite as an influence on your own work. And I also wanted to ask, are there any films or television programs that particularly interested you in the way they were edited?
Yeah. So I remember back in, I think something that really interested me was I think it was about 2005, the year that my daughter was born, was something called Candy Rush? Sugar Rush. So sorry, Sugar Rush. It was a fantastic little drama about a couple of 15-year-old girls. It ran to 2 series, and it had the most amazing soundtrack, use of soundtrack, pumping music, fast cutting, whip pans, screech to a halt, next part, next action. It was beautifully put together. So it was quite. I thought it was quite new for the time, and I did try to copy that style myself with one of the short films I worked on. Were you asking about favourite films?
Yeah, were there any particular films, whether they be Hollywood films or films from outside of the Hollywood system, that particularly inspired you, the way they were cut, or maybe they did something to kind of push the art form forward in a certain way?
I had a real liking for horror films and a bit of sci-fi and fantasy. I was really into aliens when I must have been in my early 20s or so, I think. Things like John Carpenter's The Thing, Ridley Scott, James Cameron, kind of thing. I think it was quite a masculine style, I suppose. The tension, I suppose, with Ridley Scott, I think his use of tension was a real eye-opener. Well, I mean, he was just a fantastic storyteller, wasn't he? Thelma and Louise. I mean, brilliant.
Blade Runner still remains one of my all-time favorite films, and I've seen it.
And how about that for a soundtrack? Wow. Yeah.
Vangelis, who sadly died this year, didn't he? Tremendous composer. I've seen that film, I think, 3 or 4 times in the cinema, and it's still, for me, it always feels fresh. It feels still very new. It doesn't feel 40 years old.
It doesn't, does it? No. However, the remake.
The sequel. Yeah.
Sequel. Sorry. Yeah. Didn't do it for me in the same way at all. Sorry.
Some prolific names mentioned there. And, interestingly, John Carpenter's name dropped in, who's again a very talented composer, musician. I did catch The Fog the other day. I'd never seen that film.
No.
I quite enjoyed that, I have to be honest.
Yeah.
Let's move away from film. You mentioned earlier that today you still kind of have this romanticism for editing, and occasionally you edit family videos or things for people's celebrations, birthdays, etc. I wanted to ask, outside of your work as an editor, what are your interests and hobbies? What do you like to do to relax?
Okay.
And I also wanted to ask you, Jane, do you have a family? And how do they look at your career and all these amazing projects that you've worked on?
Oh, well, my poor little family. My daughter has had to work on these with me. So,
Oh, right, okay.
so whenever I've needed a stand-in voice for one of the child characters, I was like, hello, give me a hand. Yeah, so she's never actually got to star in the end, unfortunately, but she's come along and helped me with loads of stuff, and she's done some live action videos for me as reference for animators and stuff like that. So she was, because I did quite a lot of work from home, just in the edit suite behind me here. So she's grown up with all sorts of stuff that I've been doing in here, and oops. She'll be home in a second. Actually, I think that was her just arriving, and she usually tiptoes past my room, I was going to say, but I'm not sure she will tonight. And you were asking about stuff that I like doing. I love horse riding, and I found a fantastic trekking stables up on the Mendips. So I try to take a couple of hours out once a week and ride up there. It's a fantastic place. And other than that, I've got a big garden that keeps me busy as well.
Jane, we come to that final point in the interview. These questions we ask every single Your Take guest. So all 80 plus guests have answered these same questions. They're what we call quick fire questions, just to find out things we maybe not established in the last 60 minutes.
Okay.
Don't have to think about these in any great depth, but here we go. We always get some interesting responses. Number one, Jane Hicks, what would you say is your favourite pastime?
Oh, horse riding.
Right, let's go back to cinema. You've cited many interesting filmmakers or people involved in the filmmaking process, but what would you choose as your favourite film and why?
Okay, Thelma and Louise. Why?
Ridley Scott again, yeah.
Yeah, Ridley Scott again, yes. The emotional journey.
I always like listening to Ridley Scott as well. I find him a fascinating, very straight talking individual, and I always just find him a great mind of information, an intellect, and an interesting kind of connoisseur on the cinema, a little bit like Martin Scorsese. We go from a Ridley Scott film to asking your favourite novelist. Who would you choose?
Oh, Alan Bennett. I'd go for Alan Bennett, I think. Makes me laugh.
If you could have chosen a profession outside of being a film editor, what would you have chosen?
Oh, now, there's a few things. I would have loved to have been a paleontologist.
Interesting choice.
I wasn't good enough. Otherwise, I'll see something I did want to be. When I left school, I wanted to be an archaeological illustrator. But I think you only really need two of those in the world. So.
Jane, who in life would you say has been your greatest inspiration?
I worked for quite a long time with a gentleman called Bob Godfrey, who was kindest man and a very wise man. Very sadly, no longer with us, but he had such a big heart. Bob is known for rhubarb and custard.
Oh wow! Yeah.
Henry's cat, yeah, and something else. He won an Oscar for what's it called? Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Oh God, what's it called? Sorry, I've forgotten the title of the film. But
yeah, Rhubarb and Custard. I can hear the intro now
yeah.
playing in my head. Yeah,
Right, squiggly, squiggly,
yeah,
squiggly. Yeah.
they're just classic again.
Yeah.
Classic children's.
But such a lovely man.
We move from inspirations now to newspaper headlines, but do you read a newspaper? And if so, which one would be your choice?
Oh, okay. Well, used to read The Guardian, and probably read it a couple of times a year now, I'm afraid, very sadly. But I rely on BBC News.
We go from newspapers now to cuisine. What would you cite as your favourite food?
Okay, fish. I would always choose fish.
Any type of fish?
Fond of salmon and sushi. Love sushi.
This next one stumps quite a lot of our guests. We asked them to name their favourite cultural icon. And when we say cultural icon, it could be a political leader or figure, maybe an inventor, maybe somebody who's a master in their particular field, maybe someone who's changed the course of history. Who would you choose?
Oh, crikey. Well, people who come to mind are probably more in the sort of musical field. Like I was going to say Kylie Minogue, but an interesting life she's had too. But she's someone who doesn't take herself too seriously. I've seen her live a couple of times. She's very nice with the audience, I was thinking about Anne Marie as well, actually, because I've been watching her on The Voice, and she just seems to have so much to give back. You know, she's such a generous person. I don't know very much about her though. Who else would I say is a cultural icon? How about yourself, James?
Cultural icon is hard, isn't it? I had to choose one. Oh, you stumped me here. One I was fascinated by as a youngster, and I think it's mainly to do with the time and an era that you were born in. I would have chosen at one stage JFK, John Kennedy.
Crikey, yeah.
I think a lot of that is just probably wanting to have been brought up in the 1960s, and the fact that it was probably unusual at that time for such a young, dynamic person to be elected in that kind of position. Now we see it so regularly, don't we, with leaders being relatively young, in their 40s or 50s. But I think then it was probably unusual. I think the whole kind of dynasty, that it didn't last particularly long because of obviously his assassination, and I found that all fascinating as well. But that's a long debate.
But actually, I'll tell you, that's an easy question, because of course there's Vladimir Zelensky, don't you think?
Yeah. So we go from cultural icons next to curse words. What would you say is your favorite curse word, and why?
Okay. I drive around quite a lot, and this is because my wife Maria used to was a plasterer, and she had a little white van, and she used to drive around with our daughter in the front seat, in her child seat, and it was actually our daughter's first word was tosser.
Oh, brilliant.
Little white van.
Where she got that from?
Yeah, I wonder who she got that from. Yeah, quite. But I think mine's. I think I say bugger all the time. I think
when you have time to relax, take a trip away, what would you say is your favourite place or holiday destination?
Oh wow, I was so many places. I had a fantastic holiday 20 years ago. I went to Goa in India.
Yeah.
And I'd go back there tomorrow if I could, really would. But what I want to tell you, have we got time for me to tell you one more story about
of course.
Is that okay? Yeah, a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Lovely holiday in Cyprus, a family holiday. We had this little beach bungalow, and in the morning I used to walk out pretty much at sunrise, about 6 o'clock in the morning, and have a walk along the beach while it was cool. And I came across these tracks in the sand that looked like tyre tracks, or like bicycle tyre tracks, BMX tyre tracks, you know, a rough tread. And I thought, I wonder what on earth that is. And then I saw there was a mound in the sand, and the little flippers came out, and it was baby turtle
Oh,
turtle
wow.
tracks. Yeah.
Oh, it must have been incredible.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, to watch these turtles hatch out. Yeah, and I couldn't believe it, because one day there was a turtle which hadn't made it. He'd gone the wrong way, so he was going back inland instead of going to the sea. And I picked him up because he looked really, really poorly. In fact, he looked completely gone. I picked him up. I thought, oh, poor little beast. I'll put you back in the sea anyway. And as I put him in the water, he came to life. His eyes opened, his flippers started moving. I thought, whoa, what a moment, what a moment.
For your cultural icon, you picked two people who were musical, but next I wanted to ask you, who is your favourite music artist, and what would you say is your favourite album?
Oh, I've got so many. I mean, really, anybody I can dance to. I would have said Soul to Soul. I mean, the Happy Mondays. I love all hearing those really airy guitars. You know,
Bit of Bez.
Yeah.
Shaun Ryder. Yeah.
Oh yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a character. And what about an album? Anything that you listen to that you'd say is timeless?
It's probably going to be back to Pink Floyd, isn't it? You know, Dark Side of the Moon, something like that. Yeah.
Last two, Jane. Firstly, what would you say is your greatest achievement to date?
James, I think it's this interview.
That's very kind of you. And say no more. And lastly, Jane Hicks, how do you wish to be remembered?
Oh dear. Hopefully as somebody that you can share a pint with, or not share a pint with, but enjoy a pint with, and have a laugh and a bit of fun.
I think we've established that over the last 60 minutes. It's been a fascinating insight into your life as well as your career. And I must admit, there's been a tad little bit of jealousy, because I've interviewed lots of guests and I'm always in awe of musicians, but I've been very in awe of your job as an editor, but particularly this fondness for all these great children's television programs. And I will say, 40 years on, I think they're still remembered. People are still going back and watching them, rediscovering them, and
James,
getting their toys out of the loft because of the toy collections, the merchandise. Yeah.
James, yeah, and they're remaking them as well. I mean, I'm so old. They're coming round again, aren't they?
Well, the remakes are never as good.
Oh.
No. So, yeah, it's been a fascinating insight. And something else that's been interesting is, before we hit the record button, you mentioned that you had been apprehensive, slightly nervous, and putting you on the spot about doing this.
Yeah.
That certainly never came across during the 60 minutes. And you're very much a storyteller.
Oh, you sweet talker.
And it came across as a very much a love and a fondness for what you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you for helping me through it all. I hope I haven't been too boring.
Any plans, Jane, to kind of get back in the industry and do more? I know you say you're pretty much semi-retired now and enjoying life as it is, but is there part of a bit of a burning desire just to do a little bit more, or no?
Oh, every now and again I have a bit of a pang, yes. And I think if a short film came along, I probably wouldn't be able to resist, you know. But I don't think I need to get back into the industry again. I think I really think I've had my time. There are loads of talented people out there, loads more. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again. And the last interesting point is many of the interviews I do, it could be somebody the other side of the world. It could be in LA, Sydney. We've done interviews. You're literally down the end of the road. We may as well have met up in the pub somewhere, or yeah.
We're both in LA.
Indeed. Thanks again.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. No, that's really sweet of you. Thank you.